A long time ago, in the outer reaches of the galaxy where starlight filtered through broken nebulae like whispers from another age, the story began, not with battle or betrayal, but with silence. Deep in the archives of the forgotten world of Obradan, where the Jedi once kept secrets too sacred to name, something stirred. A name echoed among crumbling pillars and moss-veined stone, not spoken aloud, but carried by the hum of the Force itself. Qui-Gon Jinn, a Jedi who had walked away. From certainty, a man who had vanished not into exile, but into myth. There were those who said he had died too soon, and others who believed he had seen too much. And yet, the truth lay somewhere in between, nestled in the folds of time, like a slumbering truth, waiting to be awakened. The stars did not mourn him. They remembered him patiently. For across the veil of what had been, and what might still be, there remained a mystery tied not only to his death, but to what he had lived for. The Force had always moved strangely around Qui-Gon, even during his youth in the temple, when his master, Dooku, guided him through the halls of Coruscant's serene and solemn spires. Whispers of dissent followed him like mist. He asked questions when others obeyed. He listened not only to the council, but to the Force itself, which spoke to him in ways others could not understand. It was not defiance, it was faith. Not in doctrine or legacy, but in the living force that breathed through all things. While others focused on politics, prophecy, and ancient texts, Qui-Gon saw the currents of the present, the needs of the now. It set him apart. He walked in silence where others spoke, offered aid where others passed judgment. And when he found the boy on Tatooine, the one born of mystery and surrounded by shadow, he did not hesitate. The chosen one, he believed, Anakin Skywalker. His conviction was not born from hope alone, but from something deeper. A truth felt in his bones, a certainty the Council refused to accept. He had no proof, only vision, but to Qui-Gon, vision was enough. The records of those days are fragmentary, incomplete. Some lost to war, others deliberately erased. But remnants remain. Journals locked behind Jedi encryption. Hollow recordings never submitted to the archives. And the whispers of those who knew him best. Obi-Wan Kenobi, his loyal Padawan, who revered him, yet could not always follow where he led. Dooku, who once loved him as a son but came to see his independence as dangerous. Even Master Yoda, who saw in Qui-Gon a mind both troubling and rare. In those final days before his death on Naboo, Qui-Gon was not merely on a mission. He was chasing the last fragments of a vision that had haunted him for years. He had felt the pulse of darkness rising not from the edges of the galaxy, but from within the very core of the Republic. The Sith, he believed, had returned, not in the form of armies, but as whispers in the Senate, subtle manipulations of fate. No one believed him. The Council saw no danger. Even Obi-Wan, wise beyond his years, questioned the certainty of his master's fears, and yet beneath the surface something stirred. In a hidden archive untouched since the days of the High Republic, the message was discovered. It bore Qui-Gon's voice, quiet but resolute. He spoke of dreams that came unbidden, of futures that shifted like sand through his fingers. He spoke of Anakin, not just as a child of prophecy, but as a nexus of power unlike any he had encountered. And most hauntingly, he spoke of a shadow vast and patient, waiting to rise. It had no face, no form, only presence. The one who listens to the Force, he said, must also listen to silence. His words were not meant as warning. They were part of something larger, something he had only begun to understand. A path, not through the halls of the Jedi Order, but through the unseen spaces in between. He was not trying to change the Order. He was preparing for what would come after it. For Qui-Gon understood what few others did, that the galaxy was on the edge of transformation, and the Order as it stood could not withstand the storm. He died. With that knowledge buried in his heart, pierced not just by a Sith's blade, but by the weight of unspoken truths. And yet, his death was not the end. In the moments after, as his body lay still, the Force whispered again, not in grief, but in continuity. For Qui-Gon had found something no Jedi had touched in centuries. He had begun the path to immortality. Not through power or ritual, but through surrender, through harmony, through becoming one with the Force, not just in death, but in presence. Others would follow. Yoda would learn it in time. So would Obi-Wan, but only because Qui-Gon found it first, alone, in silence, and somewhere, in the spaces between stars, his voice lingers still. The galaxy stretches vast beyond the familiar lanes of trade and conflict. There are regions where even the Force seems to hold its breath, where ancient wreckage drifts in quiet arcs and forgotten stations float like the bones of extinct creatures. It was in one such hollow corridor of space that the journey began in earnest. A lone vessel moved quietly between stars, unarmed, unescorted, guided only by the fragments of data pulled from records thought lost to time. The mission was clear, yet undefined. The truth of Qui-Gon Jinn was not recorded in the histories shared in the Jedi Temple. What remained were scattered, cryptic traces, each piece whispering of a different man. To the Order he had been loyal, yet unpredictable. To his Padawan he had been a guide, a mentor, and a mystery. But beyond all that there were hints that Qui-Gon had touched something far more profound than anyone had realized. The first destination lay among the ruins of a Jedi outpost on Ossus, once a cradle of knowledge before it was shattered by cataclysm. There, within a crumbled sanctum half swallowed by roots and wind, a fractured holocron activated without prompt. Its glow was dim, flickering like a memory struggling to hold its shape. Within it, a voice emerged, not Qui-Gon's, but that of an archivist long gone, speaking in reverence of a Jedi who defied the Council not out of pride, but because he listened too closely to the Force. The records detailed missions rarely referenced, places where Qui-Gon had gone alone, sometimes against orders. One such world was Leril, an obscure moon where the Force thinned into strange, lucid stillness. It was there he once meditated for weeks, returning changed, quiet and certain. Clues deepened as the journey moved through abandoned Jedi strongholds, hidden caches once sealed beneath mountains of stone. In each place, remnants of his presence emerged, scorch marks from lightsaber training etched in meditation patterns, faded parchments where he'd written in dialects known only to the first Jedi philosophers. They were not records of teachings but conversations, as if he had begun speaking not to others, but to the Force itself. Alongside these fragments, personal musings were uncovered, voiceless and haunting. He had sensed a disturbance years before. Naboo, a presence dark and calculating, veiled in political harmony, but rotting beneath. He suspected not just the return of the Sith, but their evolution into something more insidious. From these fragments, it became clear that Qui-Gon had not merely predicted the future. He had seen its seeds sprouting in the present. On the outer rim world of Peshera, once a Jedi listening post, records of planetary alignments and Force anomalies matched those in his own logs. Across multiple star systems, subtle echoes pointed to a pattern too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence, and always, in the center of that web, a child seen in dreams. A boy surrounded by sand and silence, fire and light, darkness and destiny. The more pieces were uncovered, the clearer it became that he had been preparing. Not for war or rebellion, but for understanding. He sought no army, only truth. He questioned the council not to undermine it, but to awaken it. Yet few listened, fewer understood. Even those closest to him remained in the shallow end of his convictions. His Padawan, Obi-Wan, loyal and brilliant, struggled to walk beside a man who saw into currents far deeper than most dared, and his former master Dooku once respected his independence, but later called it recklessness. Perhaps that was why their parting had been so final. Perhaps that was why Dooku too fell into shadow. But if Dooku turned away from the light in search of power, Qui-Gon stepped away from the Order to seek harmony. Not control, not domination, but balance. A word, used so often by the Jedi, yet understood so little. His writings, when pieced together, formed a web of thought circling the concept of a living force, one that responded in real time, unburdened by rules or ancient prophecy. He believed the future was not written, that destiny could be shaped, not by doctrine but by choice. And yet he also knew that those choices were most powerful when aligned with the flow of the Force itself. Each revelation opened new questions. Had Qui-Gon truly believed that the Chosen One would bring balance? Or had he seen a more complex, more painful truth, one the Council dared not face? Did he hope Anakin would save the Jedi, or remake them? In a dusty enclave beneath the sands of Dantooine, where wind howled through collapsed archways, the most haunting piece was found. A sealed record, voice locked to his signature, activated not by words but presence. Within it, he spoke of love, not romantic, but a love for all life, all being. He spoke of letting go, of listening to the Force without trying to shape it, of surrender not as defeat, but as understanding. It was a perspective few shared. The Jedi trained children to control, to restrain, to suppress. Qui-Gon taught to listen, to feel, to be present. And it was this presence that shaped how he lived and died. He did not flinch before death. He did not resist. He faced it the same way he faced every day, with calm and clarity. And through that final breath, he became more than memory. He became voice. The final pieces of his journey led into the unknown. Regions where ancient Force nexuses pulsed like slow-beating hearts. Here, in unmarked space, a world was found that did not appear on any star map, shrouded in a nebula of shimmering pale light. The Force was strong there, not loud or violent, but deep and endless. On the surface of the world, amid trees whose roots glowed faintly beneath soil the color of ash, an object lay untouched by wind or time. A staff of smooth wood bound in copper wire, once used for grounding during extended meditations. Qui-Gon's name was carved into the base in small, imperfect lettering. He had been here, and he had left behind silence. It was here that the final revelation began to take form. His death had not been the end of his journey, but the beginning of a different path. What the Council had feared, what even his allies had failed to grasp, was that Qui-Gon was building something invisible, a bridge between life and what lay beyond. A way for the Force to speak again, not in visions or prophecy, but in presence. Not through power, but through love. He had seen the coming storm, and instead of fighting it, he chose to plant seeds that would grow through it. It was not a grand act of defiance that defined him. It was his refusal to stop listening, his insistence that the Force could guide the moment if one was only still enough to hear it. That message, buried beneath centuries of noise, now glows quietly in the shadows of forgotten worlds, waiting for those ready to understand. Qui-Gon Jinn did not vanish. He became something more. And his voice, soft and enduring, continues to speak in the spaces between stars. Among the farthest reaches of the archives, long sealed beneath the temple's lowest vaults before its fall, one final message from Qui-Gon. Jinn rested behind layers of forgotten encryptions. It was a simple recording, untouched by ceremony, his voice weary yet unshaken. He spoke of the living force as though it were a breath that passed through every choice, every moment, urging not control, but surrender. He warned that a time would come when the Jedi would be tested not by war, but by their own fear of letting go. It was not a warning for his peers, but for those who would come after, those who might rebuild what the Jedi had lost. Far beyond the remains of the Republic, on a silent moon that orbited no star, the journey continued. In the deep caves of Velamir, where the Force pooled in still, lucid clarity, there were writings carved into the walls not by hand, but by thought. These were not left by Qui-Gon, but by a people who had once lived in symbiosis with the Force. Long before the Jedi named it, their language hummed with rhythm and simplicity. And within that place, through meditation and stillness, his presence became unmistakable, not in word or vision, but in feeling. A calm, steady gravity, as if part of him had chosen to remain there. He had passed through this place, and it had changed him. In the remains of that ancient refuge, hidden among roots that pulsed with quiet light, lay a single data stick, wrapped in cloth aged by centuries. It was a letter, not addressed to the Council, nor to Obi-Wan, but to any who found it. In it he spoke with humility. He spoke of failure. He admitted he did not understand the full meaning of the Chosen One, that perhaps the prophecy was not meant to be understood, perhaps it was meant to be felt, that the child from Tatooine, no matter what path he took, would bring transformation. Whether to light or darkness would depend on whether he was met with compassion or fear. These were not the words of a prophet or a revolutionary. They were the reflections of a man who had felt the weight of silence pressing against his convictions. He did not claim to be right, he only claimed to listen. And in that listening, he found glimpses of truths others had lost in the noise of debate and hierarchy. As the journey reached the dying world of Tanis Prime, where the very crust of the land hummed with residual Force energy, a final chamber was found buried beneath a collapsed cliffside. Within it, a mural had been preserved through the careful application of ancient technology. The figures depicted were not labeled, but the story was clear. A lone figure knelt beside a child as a storm of darkness encircled them. Around them, others turned away, shrouded in rigidity and doubt. And high above, shaped only in faint outlines, a presence radiated not power, but peace. The mural bore no symbols, no crest of the Jedi, no seal of any known order. It was not a declaration, it was an invitation. And it became clear that those who had painted it had seen what Qui-Gon had seen. A pattern stretching across generations, one that could not be broken by force, but only softened through presence. He had not been preparing to fight fate. he had been preparing others to meet it without fear. The darkness that had come after, his death had been vast, filled with sorrow and devastation, but even in that storm his voice remained. Yoda would hear it in exile, not as a memory, but as a guide. Obi-Wan would learn to commune with it in the sands of Tatooine, and Luke Skywalker, in his moments of doubt, would walk unknowingly along the path that Qui-Gon had once cleared with quiet footsteps. None of them would fully understand the depth of his solitude, the isolation he endured from the very order he once swore to uphold, yet without his steps none of them could have found their own. He had laid the foundation not of a new Jedi Order, but of a new way of being, one that placed trust in the Force as it moved now, not as it had in legend. On the final world of the journey, in a sanctuary garden once built by lost explorers of the Force, the wind stirred the petals of trees that no longer bloomed, and there a stone was found bearing no name, only a circle carved with the gentlest hand. It was the same symbol found etched onto Qui-Gon's lightsaber hilt in early designs. Not a mark of ownership, but of unity. It was the last sign. There would be no more holocrons, no more messages, only quiet. The story of Qui-Gon Jinn did not end with prophecy fulfilled or denied. It did not end with the rise or fall of a chosen figure. It continued like a stream, threading softly beneath the surface of galactic history, shaping lives not through command, but through example. He had chosen to listen even when others would not. He had chosen to feel even when emotion was discouraged. And when his time came, he stepped into the Force, not as a master seeking power, but as a soul returning home. Now, across forgotten paths and silent ruins, his truth waits like a breath held within the galaxy itself. Not a conclusion, but a beginning. For all who seek the Force with open heart and steady mind will one day hear what he heard, not the sound of prophecy or war, but the still, quiet rhythm of presence, a rhythm he trusted more than anything else, a rhythm that guides those who dare to listen. In the years that followed Qui-Gon's passing, many within the Jedi Order moved forward as if his departure was merely another tragedy in an era full of unrest. They continued their missions, upheld tradition, and served the Republic, all while never speaking aloud the questions he had once raised. But beneath their actions, an unease stirred. Some would later whisper about the moment of his death, not with reverence, but with regret. There had been something more in him, something the Council had not fully understood, something left unresolved. Among the newly uncovered documents hidden in the lower vaults of the Jedi Temple's shadow archives was a report, unsigned, likely, buried by a scribe sympathetic to Qui-Gon's way of thinking. It detailed a mission to the Outer Rim, one undertaken by Jedi who followed Qui-Gon's teachings after his death. These Jedi were not rebels nor dissidents. They simply believed there was something more. Their search led them into strange territories, where the Force bent around them in ways the Temple never taught. And in their final entries, they described feeling as though they were being watched, not by an enemy, by him. The report closed abruptly, unfinished, but within its margins, someone had written by hand a single phrase in ancient Jedi script: "He lives in the stillness," not in the way of flesh and voice, but in the way leaves shiver in wind or water mirrors light. That simple line gave shape to what so many had dismissed. Qui-Gon had not died. He had changed form. Obi-Wan, in his years on Tatooine, would come to understand this in ways he never expected. At first, The desert was unkind, the days were long, the silence loud. Watching over the child of prophecy from afar, Obi-Wan found himself revisiting every lesson Qui-Gon had once tried to share. The words he had once questioned now returned with sharper clarity. Patience, compassion, trust in the moment. The Force is not a thing to be wielded, it is a presence to be honored. Over time, those teachings became more than memory, they became voice. One night, under the starlit sky beyond the dune sea, Obi-Wan heard it. Not a voice in the air, but inside him, deeper than sound. It was Qui-Gon, speaking not with lips or language, but through the rhythm of the Force itself. Obi-Wan did not respond, he simply listened. And in that listening he finally understood what his master had meant all those years ago, that death is not the end and that the Force, when trusted without fear, would always show the way. This communion marked a turning point. Obi-Wan began meditating not to quiet his mind, but to connect with something beyond it. Through that quiet bond, Qui-Gon continued to guide him, not as a mentor with answers, but as a presence reminding him that the greatest truths are not spoken, they are felt. He never told Obi-Wan what would happen, never laid out a path. He simply encouraged him to remain present, to care deeply, and to let go when needed. The same truth would reach Yoda in his own time. When the Clone Wars ended in ashes and the Jedi Temple fell, Yoda fled not in fear, but in sorrow. Exile was not punishment, it was necessity. On the swampy world of Dagobah, wrapped in fog and memory, Yoda sat alone with his failures. And there, after long days of reflection, he too heard the voice that should not have been possible. It was quiet, patient, unmistakably his former pupil. Through Qui-Gon, Yoda learned what had been lost, that the Jedi's greatest error was not pride or blindness, but the belief that control was strength. In truth, strength had always been in surrender. The wisdom Qui-Gon offered was simple, yet too often ignored. Listen, feel, let go. The more they embraced these truths, the closer they came to understanding the Force, not as a weapon, but as a companion. Not as a doctrine, but as life itself. Later, when Luke Skywalker would walk his own path, he too would echo these lessons, not directly, not even knowing from where they came, but guided by that same current Qui-Gon once followed. The Force does not belong to anyone. It moves as it wills. It is alive, and it responds not to strength, but to trust. Back in the ruins of a forgotten Jedi outpost buried in the frozen ridges of Polis, another piece of the story emerged. A holocron, nearly erased by time, activated for the first time in centuries. Inside, the faint echo of a training session between Qui-Gon and a young Obi-Wan flickered into view. It was not about lightsaber techniques or strategic formations. It was about stillness. In it, Qui-Gon asked his Padawan to sit in silence until the Force spoke. Hours passed in the recording. Neither moved. But when Obi-Wan finally opened his eyes, his expression had changed. He had understood something, even if he could not name it yet, and so the story wove itself tighter. Across exile, battle, death, and renewal, Qui-Gon's voice remained. Not loud, not forceful, but always present. His truth was not a prophecy fulfilled, but a lesson passed forward like a flame, small and steady, refusing to be extinguished. It glowed in Obi-Wan's protection of Luke. It whispered in Yoda's last teachings, and it stirred in the choices that shaped the future of the galaxy. It was not the victories or defeats that defined him, but the quiet moments in between. the way he stood beside the weak, the way he questioned power, the way he believed that love, not strength, was the truest path to balance. In every fragment uncovered, in every place he once walked, that belief lingered, not as legend, as truth. The Force moved with him, and in every still place across the stars, its sty, among the ruins of the galaxy's most sacred truths, there are moments when everything long buried begins to surface. Not as a tidal wave, but as a slow awakening. This is how the greatest revelations come. Not with answers, but with the shattering of assumptions. And it was through one such awakening that the final pieces of Qui-Gon Jinn's path began to make themselves known. They came not from hidden temples or sealed archives, but from the very voices of those who had once stood closest to him. On Naboo, years after his death, a preserved recording was recovered in the Theed governmental vaults. It was a message, intended for the Queen, left during the uncertain hours between his arrival and the final confrontation with the Sith. In it, Qui-Gon did not speak of politics or tactics. He spoke of the child, of Anakin. He spoke of the strange energy he had felt the moment they met. It was not merely strong, it was ancient, it was familiar. Not because he had seen the boy before, but because the Force had known him before. He believed this child had been shaped by the will of the Force itself, not in defiance of nature, but in alignment with something deeper. In his words, there was awe, but there was also hesitation. He knew the danger of such power. He recognized the weight of placing hope in one so young, one so unprepared for the burden. Yet still, he believed, not because the boy fulfilled a prophecy, but because he felt drawn toward him as if their paths had always been entangled. In that recording, he whispered something not found in the Jedi archives. He said he felt like he had found an echo of something lost, a possibility, a seed planted long ago waiting to bloom. From that moment forward, every step he took was shaped by this belief, and in doing so, he found himself more alone than ever. The Council questioned his judgment. Obi-Wan, though loyal, struggled to understand the depth of his urgency. Even Dooku, long estranged, sent a brief message through private channels warning him to tread carefully. But Qui-Gon never responded. He had made his choice, and in making it, he began to see the edges of a larger design, not one orchestrated by the Jedi or the Sith, but by the Force itself, a movement that stretched across generations, using the smallest moments to guide the greatest changes. One of the clearest insights came from a journal recovered from a Jedi courier who had traveled with Qui-Gon briefly during the border disputes in the Atrevis sector. She described a night spent watching stars fall over a quiet ridge, while Qui-Gon sat cross-legged on a blanket of moss, his eyes closed, his breathing slow. When she asked what he was doing, he said he was listening, not for answers, just for presence. He told her that the galaxy was not made of truths and lies, but of vibrations, and that sometimes the only way to know what was real was to stop, trying to define it. That moment stayed with her for years. When she later died in the Clone Wars, her final entry simply said, "He was the only one who ever saw it clearly." This statement, isolated in the last page of a worn field journal, echoed across time. It mirrored what so many others had come to realize only after his absence, that Qui-Gon was not reckless. He was not defiant for the sake of defiance. He was simply unafraid of seeing the Force for what it truly was, even if it meant letting go of the constructs built around it. Another account came from a political aide in the Senate who had once sat in a private conversation between Qui-Gon and Bail Antilles. The Jedi had come not to argue legislation, but to quietly urge restraint. He warned that the Republic's heartbeat was becoming erratic, that the systems were bending not under pressure, but under indifference. He spoke of patterns. He said that corruption does not begin with power. It begins with fear. And when the protectors of peace begin to fear change, they become something else entirely. These were not declarations of rebellion. They were signs of a deeper understanding. Qui-Gon saw that the Jedi Order was growing rigid, too devoted to structure and too dismissive of instinct. He knew that prophecy was dangerous when it became a map rather than a mirror. And he understood that the child he had found would not walk a path laid out by anyone else. He would break systems, he would force reckonings, and whether that brought salvation or destruction would depend on who stood beside him when the storm came. Qui-Gon's greatest revelation was not about Anakin, nor about the Sith. It was about the Force itself. He came to believe that it was not an entity of light or darkness, not a power to be divided or claimed. It was a living current, always flowing, always adapting, and when Jedi or Sith tried to lock it into categories, they only made themselves blind to its truth. The Force, he said in one meditation, is not divided, it is whole. It is we who divide. Those words, found etched into the stone altar of an unmarked retreat on the outer moons of Dera, spoke louder than any speech, for it meant that both light and shadow existed not as enemies, but as aspects of the same breath. Balance was not the elimination of darkness, but the understanding of it, the acceptance of its presence without surrendering to its pull. This understanding redefined everything. It redefined what it meant to be Jedi. It challenged the very foundation of the code. It forced those who listened to realize that control was not peace, and that obedience was not wisdom. It reminded them that to truly walk with the Force was to move like water, adapting, flowing, embracing the present without needing to dominate it. Qui-Gon Jinn was not a figure of rebellion. He was a figure of return. A return to listening. A return to stillness. And in the quiet folds of history, his revelations continue to unfold. Not in temples, not in battles, but in the minds and hearts of those who, like him, dare to pause, breathe and feel the galaxy not as a story told to them, but as a song sung through them. The stars above Dagobah moved slowly through the mist, barely visible through the layers of vapor that wrapped around the ancient trees. Here, on this quiet and forgotten world, a presence lingered not just in memory, but in form. Yoda, in his solitude, had come seeking not redemption or repentance, but understanding. He had seen the collapse of the Jedi Order. He had witnessed the war devour everything they once stood for. And in that stillness, he began to hear what Qui-Gon had once tried to say. Not through messages or visions, but through the Force itself, as it whispered along the roots of ancient life and passed through the smallest stirrings of breath and leaf. Yoda had not always believed him. For all his wisdom, for all his centuries of experience, there were moments when even he had chosen structure over intuition. But now, as the world slowed and silence deepened, he could feel the shape of things Qui-Gon had sensed long ago. The Force was not a static light to be worshipped or protected. It was alive, it moved freely, it responded not to codes, but to presence. In one long meditation beneath the twisted branches of a luminous tree, Yoda closed his eyes and let go of everything he thought he knew. And there, in the space between thought and being, he heard the voice again, gentle, patient, Qui-Gon. He did not speak of victories or failures. He did not condemn or praise. He simply reminded Yoda of what he had forgotten, that the Force was always here, always listening, always guiding, that death was not an end, only a threshold, that the greatest knowledge was not held in books or councils, but in surrender. Through these teachings, Yoda began to shift. Slowly, like moss growing over stone, he let go of the weight of the past and began to understand how to teach those who would one day return. His future lessons to Luke Skywalker, seemingly born from old Jedi teachings, were in truth shaped by Qui-Gon's quiet wisdom. On the other side of the galaxy, buried beneath the surface of a barren moon, another thread unraveled. In an ancient structure with no markings deep in the wild space beyond even Sith charts, a chamber was found carved from obsidian and crystal. Within it, voices had been recorded long ago, speaking in languages not heard in millennia. Among them, faint and fractured, was a voice not recognized at first. But to those who had studied the cadence, the stillness between his words, it became unmistakable. It was Qui-Gon, not preaching, not instructing, listening, responding to something vast, unseen. The recording had no context, but what it captured was a moment of communion. Not between Jedi and Sith, but between seeker and source, between presence and presence. As this discovery reached the scattered remnants of Force scholars across the galaxy, a new understanding began to take shape. The story of Qui-Gon Jinn was no longer a tale of a rogue Jedi who died before his time. It was something far deeper. It was the record of a soul who had found a thread older than the Republic, older than the Temple, older even than the Jedi themselves. He had traced that thread not out of ambition but out of longing, a longing to understand the Force, not through victory or obedience, but through relationship. And in doing so, he had touched truths buried by centuries of silence. There was evidence now that Qui-Gon had discovered something no Jedi in recorded history had fully grasped. He had found the beginning of the path to consciousness after death, a state not of power but of presence. He had become one with the Force in the truest sense, not by vanishing, but by dissolving gently into its rhythm. Those who followed his teachings later would walk that path more confidently. Obi-Wan, Yoda, even Luke in time. But he had been the first to begin it alone, without ceremony, without instruction. Only faith, and yet within all this quiet revelation, a question remained. Unanswered. Why had he begun this search in the first place? Why had Qui-Gon Jinn, of all Jedi, chosen to step away from tradition and dive into the unknown? The answer was hidden not in legend, but in one final source. A private letter found in the possession of a healer from Ord Binir, preserved in a box of cloth and herbs. It was a letter Qui-Gon had written, never sent, addressed to no one in particular. In it, he wrote of a moment as a young Padawan when he stood at the edge of a cliff on a world whose name he had forgotten. He had looked out over a valley that stretched into mist, and for the first time he had felt the Force move through him without intention. It had not asked him to act or speak. It had simply been with him. And in that moment he understood something that would guide him for the rest of his life, that the Force was not a lesson to be learned, it was a companion to be trusted. This moment became his anchor. It shaped how he approached every mission, every disagreement, every act of courage or refusal. It taught him to stand his ground not with anger, but with clarity. It taught him to walk away not out of pride, but because sometimes stillness was the only way forward. And it taught him that death was not a wall, but a door. The truth of Qui-Gon Jinn was never a prophecy fulfilled. It was a truth lived quietly, steadfastly, with each breath he took. And though his voice faded from history, it never left the Force. In every moment of stillness, in every quiet act of compassion, in every choice to listen before acting, his presence lives on. He did not fight to change the galaxy. He chose to become part of the current that would guide it back to balance, one heartbeat at a time. When the final pieces began to settle, when the fragments of Qui-Gon Jinn's life, teachings, and unspoken truths had been gathered across stars and silence, a single question remained. What had he seen in the Force that others could not? What final revelation had shaped the quiet certainty with which he walked into every storm? The answer was never written plainly, never carved into stone or sealed in a holocron. It emerged instead through patterns, through the careful threading of his thoughts across space and memory, waiting patiently to be understood. In a newly discovered chamber beneath the Jedi Temple ruins, archaeologists uncovered a sealed floor panel so carefully disguised that even during the temple's golden age it had remained unnoticed. Beneath it lay a series of scrolls written not in the formal hand of Jedi record-keepers, but in the flowing, meditative strokes of Qui-Gon himself. The scrolls were not teachings, they were reflections, notes written to no one and everyone, quietly wrestling with questions he knew might never be answered in his lifetime. The scrolls revealed a shift, one that had taken place in the final years of his life. At first, he had believed he was seeking to reform the Jedi, to return them to something more open, more honest. But over time, his focus had changed. He no longer wished to change the order. He wished to understand why it had forgotten the very thing it was built to protect. Somewhere along the centuries, the Jedi had become guardians of structure, not spirit, of control, not connection. He had seen this happening all around him, and the more he listened to the Force, the clearer it became. Balance was not something to be enforced. It was something to be remembered. The scrolls spoke of ancient visions, not glimpses of the future, but echoes of the past. He saw a time when the Jedi had not built temples or held councils, but simply walked among people, healing and learning and listening. A time when their strength came not from separating themselves from the galaxy, but by becoming a part of its rhythm. He saw that this was the way forward, that prophecy and hierarchy and doctrine would not save the galaxy. Only presence could, only truth could. One scroll spoke of the moment he first knew death would come for him soon. It was not a feeling of dread. It was not a vision of a battle. It was a moment of stillness on a transport ship, watching a child fall asleep in the corridor while the stars streamed past the window. In that moment, the Force had whispered to him that his time in this form was nearing its end. But instead of sorrow, he had felt relief. Not because he longed for rest, but because he had come to trust that his voice would continue, not as memory, but as light. He began to prepare, not through strategy or resistance, but through surrender. He gave more time to meditation, not to detach from the world, but to become part of it more fully. He began practicing techniques long forgotten, ways of letting the self dissolve gently into the current of the Force. And in the final days before Naboo, before the duel that would claim his body, he had already let go of fear. The confrontation with the Sith, with the dark warrior cloaked in silent fury, was not a test of strength to him. It was a final act of clarity. He did not fight to win, he fought to protect what he believed in. And even in the last moment, when the blade struck, and his breath faltered, he was not afraid, because he had already stepped beyond the boundaries of life and death. He had already found the path. The final truth was this: Qui-Gon Jinn did not lose his life. He gave it, willingly, with the understanding that it would not end him, but carry him further into the rhythm he had trusted all along. In that act, he became the first to bridge the distance between living and becoming one with the Force while still holding on to awareness. Not through domination, but through surrender. Not to escape suffering, but to remain with those who needed him most. And it was in that act, gentle and unheralded, that he completed a journey no other Jedi had taken. He became the still voice that would echo through the hearts of those who remained. He became the guide not seen, but felt. His presence would shape the path of Yoda, of Obi-Wan, and of Luke. It would shape the moments that turned fate, not through power, but through quiet. At the end of the final scroll, beneath his last written words, was a mark, a single curved line, not a symbol of ending, a symbol of breath. The kind taken just before one speaks or listens or begins again. This was Qui-Gon's gift. Not a secret to be uncovered, but a way to live, a way to listen, a way to return again and again to the presence of the Force. To choose peace even when peace seemed lost. To trust the moment. To walk without fear. And in doing so, to leave behind not a shadow, but a path. When the Jedi Temple fell and the Order collapsed under the weight of war and betrayal, the galaxy changed. What had once stood as a symbol of clarity and peace became a memory wrapped in silence and flame. In that silence, people began to remember differently. They looked beyond the battlefield, beyond the armies and the sabers and the banners of light and dark. They began to search for something that felt real again, something that endured not through control, but through understanding. And in that search, again and again, the same name surfaced. Not in public discourse or grand histories, but in quiet conversations, in faded journals, in the meditations of those left wandering. Qui-Gon Jinn. There was no final message, no farewell carved into stone. There was only the legacy of a man who had seen the storm long before it arrived, and who had chosen to face it not with ambition, but with clarity. What had been dismissed by the Council as stubbornness, what had been questioned even by his closest allies, was now seen with new eyes. He had not resisted the flow of change, he had moved with it. While others debated prophecies and struggled to hold together the crumbling republic, he had listened to the subtle currents beneath the surface, to the whispers that spoke not of conquest, but of restoration. It became clear that the Force had not shown him a future to be feared. It had shown him the danger of clinging too tightly to order. The tragedy was not that the Sith returned in secret. The tragedy was that the Jedi had forgotten how to hear the Force clearly enough to know they already had. Qui-Gon had felt it, the manipulation of events, the subtle hand behind galactic policy, the cold presence that worked not through destruction, but through influence. He had seen the shape of a shadow cast long before a single war began. This understanding, buried in his reflections and left in pieces across the galaxy, was finally pieced together. He had suspected that someone had already begun shaping the future from the highest levels of the Republic. A hidden Sith Lord, not in the shadows of forgotten systems, but among senators and chancellors. And in one recovered recording, nearly Lost to time, Qui-Gon had named his fear. He did not know the name of the Sith, but he had felt their presence. Not just near him, but near the child he believed had been shaped by the will of the Force. Anakin Skywalker. He feared that the prophecy of the Chosen One had already been touched by darkness before it could unfold, that if the Jedi refused to act not just with caution, but with compassion, they would lose him, and with him the chance to understand what balance truly meant. This was the last open wound in Qui-Gon's story. The truth he had sensed but never lived to see resolved. It was not that he believed Anakin would save the Jedi, it was that he believed Anakin would become whatever the galaxy gave him room to become. And the Jedi, for all their wisdom, had not given him room. They had given him rules. Qui-Gon's final hope had never been about triumph. It had been about trust. Trust in the Force. Trust in the child. Trust that even through loss, the galaxy could be reminded how to breathe again. And even though that trust had been tested through years of fire and war, it had not been misplaced. For in the end, it was not power that turned the tide. It was choice. The choice of one man to return to compassion in the face of darkness. And that choice, like a soft ripple, echoed back through every lesson Qui-Gon had tried to share. The third and final mystery of Qui-Gon's journey was not one of fate, it was one of influence, the realization that his voice, though silenced, in life had continued to shape events long after. Through Yoda's exile and reflection, through Obi-Wan's patient watch over a boy destined to choose, through Luke's defiance not of power, but of hatred, Qui-Gon had once